Picture this. You are standing in the shadowed antechamber of Versailles Palace on a frigid December morning in 1770. The air hangs thick with the scent of rose water and burning candles, but underneath lurks something more unsettling: the metallic tang of fear. Through ornate double doors carved with golden cherubs, you hear the rustle of silk gowns and hushed whispers in rapid French. Behind those doors waits Marie Antoinette, barely 15 years old, trembling in a white chemise that feels more like a burial shroud than bridal wear. But she is not alone. Surrounding her are a dozen stern-faced women, physicians with cold hands and colder instruments, and court officials whose job it is to document every humiliating detail of what comes next. This is not a wedding preparation. This is an examination, a ritual so invasive and degrading that it would make modern medical procedures seem gentle by comparison. Today, the future Queen of France must prove her worthiness through the most intimate violation imaginable. Her virginity must be verified, measured, and certified before the eyes of strangers who will decide whether she is pure enough to marry the Dauphin. The young Austrian princess has no idea that this moment will haunt her for the rest of her short life. She cannot foresee that the trauma of this examination will affect her marriage, her ability to conceive, and ultimately contribute to the revolutionary hatred that will cost her head. All she knows is the cold marble beneath her bare feet and the terrible understanding that her most private self is about to become public property. Welcome to the world of royal virginity testing, where the most powerful women in history were reduced to specimens in laboratories of royal physicians, where crowns were won and lost based on the condition of a membrane, where future queens underwent procedures so barbaric they would be considered torture by today's standards. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What I'm about to reveal will shock you. These weren't isolated incidents or cultural curiosities from a more primitive time. These were systematic practices carried out by the most sophisticated courts in Europe, performed by royal physicians who believed they were conducting legitimate medical examinations. The procedures were documented in excruciating detail, preserved in royal archives that historians have only recently begun to examine without flinching. The testing methods varied from court to court, but they shared common elements that would make your skin crawl: physical examinations involving instruments that had never been sterilized, invasive procedures performed without anesthesia while multiple witnesses observed and recorded every detail, psychological interrogations designed to break down any resistance or deception, and always, the understanding that failure meant social destruction, exile, or death. These examinations weren't just about confirming virginity, they were about power, control, and the systematic dehumanization of women whose only value lay in their ability to produce legitimate heirs. Royal bloodlines depended on absolute certainty that children belonged to their supposed fathers. In an era before DNA testing, a woman's sexual history was the only guarantee dynasties could rely on. But here's what makes these stories particularly horrifying. The women subjected to these tests weren't peasants or criminals. They were princesses, duchesses, and future queens, the most privileged women in their societies, protected by wealth and noble birth, yet utterly powerless when it came to their own bodies. If this could happen to them, imagine what ordinary women endured. The French court, where our story began, had perfected virginity testing into an art form of systematic humiliation. The examination of Marie Antoinette was just one link in a chain of degradation that stretched back centuries. French royal physicians maintained detailed records of their procedures, creating a library of intimate violation that reads like medical horror fiction. The tools they used were primitive and terrifying. metal speculums that had been used on countless other women without cleaning, ivory probes designed to measure and evaluate, glass instruments that could shatter inside the body. All of this performed by men who believed they were conducting legitimate scientific inquiry into female purity. The psychological torture was often worse than the physical violation. Young women would be questioned for hours about their thoughts, dreams, and desires. Any sign of sexual knowledge or curiosity was taken as evidence of corruption. They were forced to describe their most intimate experiences, while strangers took notes and made judgments about their moral worth. The Spanish Habsburg court, which we'll explore in detail, took these practices to even more extreme levels. Their virginity tests were combined with examinations for fertility, genetic purity, and religious orthodoxy. Spanish royal women underwent procedures that would be considered war crimes by modern standards, all in the name of preserving bloodline integrity. But the English court may have been the most sophisticated in their approach to royal virginity testing. They developed psychological techniques designed to break down resistance and extract confessions. English royal physicians pioneered methods of examining women that were supposedly less invasive but actually more psychologically damaging than crude physical examinations. What makes these stories particularly tragic is how the women themselves internalize these violations. Many came to believe that their worth as human beings depended on the condition of their hymens. They would volunteer for repeated examinations, desperate to prove their purity to skeptical courts. Some developed what we would now recognize as severe trauma responses, becoming unable to function normally in their marriages or daily lives. The ripple effects of these practices extended far beyond the examination chambers. Royal marriages were delayed or cancelled based on test results. International alliances crumbled when virginity examinations revealed supposedly scandalous findings. Wars were fought over questions of royal legitimacy that trace back to these intimate violations. The physicians who performed these examinations weren't monsters, at least not in their own minds. They believed they were serving their kingdoms by ensuring royal bloodline purity. They developed elaborate theories about female anatomy and sexuality that justified their procedures. They wrote learned treatises about the connection between physical virginity and moral character. But their ignorance of basic female anatomy made their examinations both useless and dangerous. They believed myths about hymens that had no basis in medical reality. They interpreted normal anatomical variations as signs of sexual activity. They caused infections, injuries, and permanent damage while claiming to protect royal virtue. The women who survived these ordeals often spent the rest of their lives dealing with the consequences: physical injuries that affected their ability to bear children, psychological trauma that made normal relationships impossible, social stigma that followed them even after they had supposedly proven their purity. And here's the most disturbing part. These practices weren't abandoned because people recognized their cruelty or medical uselessness. They were discontinued only when political changes made them inconvenient for royal families. The suffering they caused was simply forgotten, buried in archives along with the detailed records of each humiliating examination. The Austrian court where Marie Antoinette originated had its own twisted traditions that would follow her to France like a curse. The Habsburgs believed that virginity testing was not just a medical necessity, but a sacred ritual that connected them to divine authority. Their examinations were performed in chapel-like chambers decorated with religious imagery, as if God himself was overseeing the violation of young women's bodies. The instruments used in Vienna were crafted by the same artisans who made religious artifacts: golden speculums inlaid with precious stones, ivory probes blessed by court chaplains, crystal examination tools that were supposedly purified through prayer and holy water. This religious veneer made the procedures even more psychologically devastating because resistance was considered not just medical non-compliance but spiritual rebellion. Marie Antoinette's examination in 1770 lasted over 4 hours. Court records describe how she fainted twice during the procedure and had to be revived with smelling salts. The French physicians found her anatomy to be what they termed unusually delicate, requiring special care during future examinations. This supposed delicacy would later be used to explain her difficulties conceiving children, though modern medical understanding suggests the trauma of repeated examinations was more likely responsible. The documentation from her testing reveals the extent of the humiliation. Every detail was recorded by court scribes who sat behind screens, taking notes on everything from her physical responses to her emotional state. These records were then sealed and stored in royal archives, creating permanent documentation of her most private moments that could be referenced in future political disputes. But Marie Antoinette's ordeal was mild compared to what Spanish royal women endured under the Habsburg system of purity verification. The Spanish court had developed what they called the Seven Sacred Examinations, a series of increasingly invasive procedures performed over 7 consecutive days. Each examination was more intrusive than the last, designed to break down any possible deception or resistance. The first examination was purely visual, conducted by a panel of 12 court ladies who would inspect the candidate's entire body for any signs of sexual activity. They looked for marks, scars, or changes in skin tone that might indicate physical intimacy. Even birthmarks or moles were scrutinized as potential evidence of corruption. The second through 6th examinations involved increasingly invasive physical procedures performed by royal physicians using instruments that grew progressively larger and more uncomfortable. The woman being tested was required to remain conscious throughout each procedure, so she could respond to questions about her sensations and experiences. The 7th and final examination was the most horrifying. It combined physical violation with psychological torture designed to extract any confession of sexual activity. The woman was placed in a device called the Chair of Truth, which held her in an exposed position while multiple physicians and court officials conducted simultaneous examinations of different parts of her body. Spanish royal records from the 16th and 17th centuries contain detailed drawings and descriptions of these procedures that are so graphic, they remained classified in royal archives until the late 20th century. Modern historians who have examined these documents describe them as among the most disturbing examples of institutionalized sexual violence in European history. The psychological impact of these examinations often proved more damaging than the physical trauma. Many Spanish royal women developed what court physicians termed melancholia virginalis, a condition characterized by extreme anxiety, depression, and inability to form normal relationships. Modern psychiatrists recognize these symptoms as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The English approach to virginity testing was different but equally devastating. Rather than relying primarily on physical examination, English court physicians developed sophisticated psychological techniques designed to manipulate women into revealing their sexual histories. They believed that guilty women would inevitably betray themselves through subtle behavioral cues that trained observers could detect. English royal women were subjected to days of intensive questioning conducted by teams of physicians, clergymen, and court officials trained in what they called the science of feminine truth. These interrogations were designed to exhaust the subject's mental defenses and extract confessions through psychological pressure rather than physical force. The questioning techniques were remarkably similar to modern psychological torture methods. Sleep deprivation, isolation, constant surveillance, and manipulation of basic needs like food and water. The women were told that cooperation would lead to mercy, while resistance would result in increasingly severe examinations. English court records describe how women would sometimes confess to sexual activities that had never occurred simply to end the psychological torment. These false confessions would then be used to justify their exclusion from royal succession or their exile from court, destroying their lives based on admissions extracted through torture. The broader European context reveals that these practices were not isolated cultural aberrations, but systematic methods of controlling female sexuality and ensuring male control over royal bloodlines. Courts across the continent shared information about examination techniques and collaborated on developing new methods of verification. The Protestant Reformation added religious dimensions to these practices that made them even more cruel. Protestant courts claimed that Catholic examination methods were corrupted by superstition, while Catholic courts insisted that Protestant techniques were insufficiently thorough. This religious competition led to an escalation of invasive procedures as each tradition tried to prove its superiority. The medical understanding that justified these practices was based on fundamental misconceptions about female anatomy that persisted for centuries. Royal physicians believed that virginity was a physical condition that could be objectively measured and verified, when in reality, the hymen is a flexible membrane that varies greatly between individuals and can be affected by numerous non-sexual activities. These misconceptions led to tragic miscarriages of justice, where women were condemned as impure based on normal anatomical variations. Court records contain numerous cases of royal women who were exiled or executed because their natural anatomy didn't conform to medical myths about virginity. The end of royal virginity testing came not through recognition of its cruelty, but through political changes that made it inconvenient for royal families. As absolute monarchy gave way to constitutional government, the intimate details of royal sexuality became political liabilities rather than sources of legitimacy. The last documented royal virginity examination in Europe took place in 1889, but the psychological and cultural damage of these practices continued to affect royal families for generations. The trauma was passed down through family stories and cultural expectations that shaped how royal women understood their own bodies and sexuality. Today, these historical practices serve as stark reminders of how medical authority can be used to justify systematic oppression. The detailed records preserved in royal archives provide disturbing evidence of how supposedly scientific procedures can mask institutionalized violence against women. As we return to that shadowed antechamber at Versailles, where our story began, we can finally understand the full weight of what young Marie Antoinette endured. The examination that seemed like a single moment of humiliation was actually part of a vast system of control that reduced the most powerful women in Europe to specimens in laboratories of royal physicians. The candles that flickered in those ornate chambers have long since burned out, and the instruments of examination have crumbled to dust, but the records remain, preserved in archives across Europe, testament to a time when crowns were won and lost based on the condition of a membrane, and when the most intimate violations were justified in the name of royal purity. These women, these queens and princesses who suffered in silence behind palace doors, deserve to have their stories told without the sanitized versions that protect royal reputations. Their pain was real, their trauma was lasting, and their courage in enduring these ordeals while maintaining their dignity deserves recognition across the centuries. The next time you see a portrait of a royal woman from this era, remember that behind her serene expression and magnificent gown lies a story of survival that history tried to forget. In their painted eyes, you might glimpse the shadows of examination chambers, where powerful women were reduced to medical specimens, and where the price of a crown was measured in humiliation and pain.